Good morning, everybody, and thank you for your patience. We had delays at airport security downstairs. Some of you are considered a threat, I can see. Secondly, we had a little bit of, because of the delay, we had to do a reboot on the AV system, but we're now ready to go. So first of all, thank you for being here. It's a very cold morning. Some of you have come from a long way away, from much warmer climes. Jeremy Martin, our old friend, of course, has come from La Jolla, where it's always just delightful. But Jeremy, of course, is a DC native, and so he's used to it, deep in his soul. Thank you to our board members who are going to be with us today. In particular, some of the energy companies that support our work. And for us, it's very, very important that we keep up to date with everything that's happening in Mexican energy, and that's why these kind of events are so important. We hope to achieve a number of goals here today. First of all, we are doing the official launch of our book, Mexico's New Energy Reform, which we launched in Mexico City at the end of last year. But we have the English language version here, and I urge you to pick up a copy. It's a terrific collection of pieces which both document the process of the energy reform of 2013-2014, but also provide an evaluation of how that reform has worked out. And our idea was that by the end of the Peña Nieto administration, we could provide an analysis of the pros and cons of the energy reform, so that the incoming administration would actually have a document to which they could refer. Now, whether or not the administration wants to read this book, there's another question. But at least we have provided the material for them to do so. So we want to launch this book, and our first panel, of course, will be largely focused on that book. The second purpose is to introduce some new voices in Mexican energy analysis to a Washington audience. This was an idea that came from one of our board members, and they said, and no disrespect to the people on this panel, but they said, yeah, we've heard a lot from these people before, so why don't you get some new voices in? So I listened, and I decided to invite some people who have not had the chance to share their views with a Washington crowd before. So we're very grateful to them for being here. Thirdly, we'll have a panel to just for the end of the program, which will look at how the private sector is adapting to the new energy environment in Mexico. We want to hear, of course, from the regulators. We have two representatives from regulatory bodies in Mexico who will be speaking today. And all of this, of course, is in the context of what is happening in the Mexican energy sector under AMLO. So as much as we're looking back at what the reform has delivered, what we want to do is, of course, to look at the reality today and to try to provide some analysis for what we see coming in the months and years ahead. It's been an extraordinarily active first couple of months, of course, for the Andrés Manuel López Obrador administration. I was down in Mexico City a week and a half ago, and people kept saying to me, it feels like he's been president for years because so much has actually happened. And if you just look at what has happened on the energy front, it's a really quite incredible story. Of course, we all know about Andrés Manuel López Obrador's long-standing opposition to the energy reform. We know about his campaign promises. His campaign promises were that he would not reverse the reform, but that he would seek to change secondary legislation, the hydrocarbons law, and that's something that we can speculate about and see what is likely to happen with the secondary laws. We know the story of the refinery, the Dos Bocas refinery. This is really a hugely important project for the government and for the president himself. And we've had all kinds of controversy about how much that refinery is going to cost, whether it's possible to build it in the Dos Bocas site, and if so, how does the government make that happen within a reasonable period of time? In addition to that, we've had the cancellation, or at least the postponement, indefinite, of bidding rounds for oil and gas. We've had the cancellation of auctions for electricity generation. We've had the cancellation of farm-outs. There will be no more farm-outs until the president is satisfied with what those farm-outs have delivered so far. We've heard all about the woes of Pemex, and we'll hear more about them on this panel today. We've had, of course, the drama of the war against the huachicoleo, the fuel theft. We've had gasoline shortages, which were connected to that. And think about this. This is all since the 1st of December. This is really, I mean, in the previous administration of Peña Nieto, by this point we were talking about, well, will there be an energy reform? And things just continued. There has been enormous turbulence, I would say, in the Mexican energy sector just in the past 2 months. And lastly, to kind of wrap it all up, or to put the cherry on top of the cake, we've had the conversation about what the president likes to call energy sovereignty. We may call it energy independence or energy security, but energy sovereignty. He's talked about the fact that he doesn't want to import gasoline from other countries, hence the refinery and the refits of existing refineries. We've heard from members of his cabinet that they don't want to import natural gas. That, in the short term, would, of course, be suicidal for the Mexican economy. But long term, is it such a bad goal? Natural gas independence, but no fracking. Once again, we heard yesterday the energy minister, Rocío Nale, talking about the fact that she will not allow fracking, but they're going to find some new technology that will allow them to extract natural gas from underneath Mexico's earth. I find that quite remarkable, but you never know. It may happen. Of course, Rocío Nale, the energy minister, has also talked about the fact that she doesn't want to import light crude from the United States, which complicates the existing refining capacity of the country. But anyway, there is clearly a focus here on Mexican energy independence, Mexican energy sovereignty. And all of that, when you pull all of this together, the disruption, the turbulence, this kind of ideology, what have we seen? We've seen investor uncertainty. I've shared this story a number of times over the past couple of weeks. But last week I was in Miami at an investor conference. And in a room of 150 investors, I asked the crowd, how many people feel comfortable investing in Mexico right now? And if I'd asked that question 3 years ago, I think everybody would have raised their hand. And 2 people raised their hand last week. People are more than a little bit freaked out, I would say, about what's happening right now in Mexico, and in particular in the energy sector. So our goal here today is to try to shed some light on the energy sector, to engage in a dialogue about the future of the sector. We invited both the Energy Secretary, Rocío Nale, and the Undersecretary, Alberto Montoya. The Undersecretary kindly accepted, but then within 24 hours cancelled. It's a shame. We would have loved to have had a representative of the government here. Unfortunately, the position of a sort of energy minister at the Mexican embassy is no longer really there. It's been absorbed into somebody from Relaciones Exteriores. But we do hope that the Mexican government accepts our invitation at some point to come and speak about their plans for the energy sector. We'll try to do what we can. Let's dive straight into our first panel. And for that, I will turn the microphone over to my co-author, co-conspirator in multiple projects, Jeremy Martin. Jeremy.
Good morning. Well, thanks, Duncan. Appreciate the invitation to join everyone here. Good morning, everyone. Glad you made it through airport security. You guys might think of a TSA pre-check kind of Woodrow Wilson.
You would never pass, Jeremy.
I know. Yes, indeed. So let me first quickly introduce our panel. Lisa Vicitti is the Director of the Energy, Climate Change, and Extractive Industry Program at the Inter-American Dialogue. Good morning, Lisa.
Good morning.
Another co-conspirator.
Yes.
Unindicted co-conspirator. There you go. Noel Maurer is Associate Professor. I'm sorry.
Nothing's been proven.
Well, not yet. We'll see how this panel unfolds here. Noel Maurer is Associate Professor of International Affairs and International Business at George Washington University. Noel, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Jeremy.
Leticia Abad is Associate Professor of Economics at the City University of New York, Queens College. Hello, Leticia.
Hello.
And Duncan Wood, hello again. Another panelist here. You move so fluidly and easily from the podium to the panel here. So speaking of fluid, that's the word. Duncan laid out a very nice introduction. And right now, I keep trying to think about how to respond to the various questions we get about, well, what's going on in Mexico? What's happening with the energy sector? And I keep coming back to that word. It's so fluid. We are in a moment of fluidity. Things are very fluid. It's moving. It's like water. We're not sure where it's going to go. So I think that's what we want to talk a little bit about, of course, in the context of the book that we produced last year here. And so if you'll humor me for a minute before I turn it over to Lisa to formally kick off the panel, I just wanted to revisit, and actually I did this the other day just to recall for myself what the heck had I written about in my chapter, but more importantly, after I went through all the plaudits and I enumerated all the important things that had happened with the 2013-14 reform in the oil sector, what had I posited as sort of the things to focus on, regardless of who won last July's election. And so I was very interested to see what recommendations I'd written last January and February. And you have the book there, but let me just read for you what I did, because I think it will encapsulate a lot of what Duncan just referred to in his opening and a lot of what I had prepared just to set the stage for our conversation. But what I said is that there's about 5 areas, broad areas, no matter who the next government in Mexico, no matter what the exact political outcome, that should happen in terms of consolidating the reform. But I think you could argue that would need to happen in terms of consolidating the advances of Mexico's energy sector. First is revising and refining the vision for the reform of the oil sector. I had posited that I think at the end of, or during the Peña Nieto government and toward the end, there was still a real need to understand what the vision for the sector, the oil sector. Is it a palanca de desarrollo? Is it merely an economic industrialization effort, or is it a true driver of energy security, or what exactly? And I think what Duncan has talked about, we have begun to hear what seems to be a clear vision for the oil sector from the López Obrador government. Perhaps focused specifically on refining, but yet they've also set a goal for oil production. They have set a goal for an enormous recovery. The goal is anywhere from 2.4 to 2.6 million barrels a day. And for those of you in the room know that is a very large goal and a very large amount of oil. So what exactly are we considering here in terms of that first point, revising and refining the vision for the sector, the oil sector? And of course, within that came to my second point, and that exactly is, well, what's going to be needed to further reform the national oil company at Pemex? That's something we can come back to. The third point is something that I think is perhaps the most fluid of what we're looking at today, and perhaps the most disturbing on many levels. And I had written about the need to balance regulation, oversight, and investment. And we'll hear from a couple of the regulators later today. But let me just pause to say that one of my most worrisome moments right now is what's happened the last couple of weeks with the CRE, and what's happened in terms of, let's just be honest, it's been an attack on the leadership of the regulatory body, the CRE. And so I think in terms of balancing regulation investment, what exactly is this government going to do in terms of in terms of CRE and CNH, autonomous independent regulatory bodies set up to ensure the proper functioning of the electric sector, the oil and gas sector in Mexico? So balancing regulation and investment, and this issue of where do regulatory bodies truly fit in the overall vision of the López Obrador government? I don't think we know yet, but like I said, the last couple of weeks, some of the trends, and not just the personal attacks, but the reduction in budget, the elimination of staff, and what I would suggest is an overall effort to diminish their ability to exercise their functions. We've seen commissioners leaving, some for personal reasons, some I would suggest for those challenges that this government has placed upon them. There's not a quorum at the CRE. The CNH is soon to be without enough commissioners. So I think that's something we want to continue to really look at is what does the López Obrador government really seek to achieve when it takes this position with the regulatory institutions in the energy sector? And the final point on that is perhaps one of the failures of the reform was in the creation of ASEA, and I know Luis Vera is here. He'll speak to us later. Good morning, Luis. And ASEA is not an independent regulatory body. It's a regulatory body that was set up, but still depends on the oversight and management of Semarnat, the Ministry of Environment. And so I think that's something else that is now presenting a challenge as we go forward in the new government. Just exactly how effective can ASEA be, despite the fact that it's not an independent, autonomous institution that perhaps was a shortcoming of the reform. It celebrated its 4th anniversary. It's done a lot of excellent work, continues to do excellent work with limited resources. But again, I think this challenge of still being formally part of the government and reporting to a ministry is something to consider. Improving security and reducing fuel theft is something that I had written a little bit about. I certainly did not write about it in the intention of what has transpired, and perhaps what was the most dominating of headlines for January, which was indeed, as Duncan mentioned, the efforts of the government to reduce the fuel theft, the robbery of fuel products in Mexico. Where that fits in the vision, where it fits in more of an effort for the López Obrador government to play to its reducing corruption message, I think is an interesting thing to discuss. There have been gains. The government has been very proud to talk about the reduction in illegal taps and illegal fuel theft and the amount of money that now has been reduced in terms of the theft. How sustainable is that, and will they be able to continue with that? I think are questions that we continue to want to see. But also, do the ends justify the means? And so, although this was an issue that I highlighted, and I think all of us understood to be enormously important, not just fiscally, but in terms of managerially of the sector, do the current ends justify the means of the government's approach? And was there really a strategy in terms of reducing the fuel theft? And finally, highlighting benefits, and that's something that I had written about, and I think we all agree has always been one of the biggest challenges when you have such a complex matter such as energy and energy reform. How do you translate these incredibly complex issues into what are readily apparent benefits for the average citizen? It's been the challenge for years in Mexico, and I don't think we have solved it yet. And Noel showed me a news alert talking about that, well, the president is absolutely in favor of privatization and private participation as long as it benefits society and as long as the benefits are clear. And I think that's something that we continue to struggle with. And the previous government worked to define the number of contracts let, the number of investment dollars committed, the number of new players in the market, and those are all important metrics. But at the end of the day, what do those really mean for the average citizen, and how do you really translate the benefits? And I think that's something that we all in this room would agree. There have been enormous benefits, an amazing amount of maturation and advancement in Mexico's energy sector because and thanks to the reforms. But really, how do you translate those benefits and highlight them for the average Mexican citizen? So I've totally abused my moderator duties here, but thank you for allowing me to do that. And let me invite Lisa to speak more specifically about the renewable energy sector. And I think that's something we also want to try and understand. And perhaps it's something that was a little bit surprising so far. Duncan mentioned the cancellation of the electricity auction. I think all of us are not surprised at all by the posture towards the oil and gas sector, Pemex, but what's become a fairly polemic approach to electricity is now also interesting to follow. Lisa.
Yeah, thank you. Duncan, thank you for the invitation. The Mexico Institute has played such an important role in the energy debate in Mexico. Thank you. So it was a great opportunity for me to contribute to this project.
Can you sit to the side because you're just in front of your
sure.
own PowerPoint.
Why don't you come and sit here?
Okay. Thanks. So yeah, I have a few slides, but I'm not going to rely too much on the slides, just a little bit of background information. So I wrote the chapter about renewable energy, and just to highlight, sort of the key points from the chapter. One was, I think, a lot of the focus on the reform was about the oil sector, but the reform also really did help facilitate the introduction of renewable energy into the grid. So there was basically two reasons that it did that. So let me show, we've seen a big increase in clean energy investment in Mexico over the last couple of years. Basically, one, the reform opened up the wholesale market to private investment and it established competitive auctions. So it broke the monopoly of the CFE. It created an independent system operator, SENACE. Before the reform, private power generation could only be in certain situations where it was very small scale or if it was self-generation. And the lack of market competition for the power generation contracts created inefficient practices like continuing obsolete plants. CFE's finances were very weak, so its ability to build renewable energy generation plants was limited, and it was really burdened by subsidies to residential and agricultural consumers, which really hurt its finances. So since the reform, we've seen 3 auctions. And I would say that they have been very successful. They brought 7.5 gigawatts of energy awarded, $8.6 billion in investment, and really significantly, the cost has gone down. From the first auction, it was about $48 in 2016 per megawatt hour, and in 2017, $20 per megawatt hour. So we've seen really record low prices. And the auctions, a lot of the capacity went in particular to wind and solar. And so it created a lot of potential capacity in these sources, which were extremely limited before. It also included participation from both major international players and local players. And in the third auction, the CFE was not the only off-taker. It was the only off-taker in the first two, and it reduced its percentage to 91% in the third. So we start to see new players in the off-taker space as well. And it also allowed private companies to acquire transmission rights. So in the past, CFE, also because of weak finances, was not able to invest what it needed to in the grid. And so this now created the possibility for private investment in transmission and distribution. So that's one. Then I think the other reason that the reform was important to promoting renewable energy was because it created policies that were specific to clean energy. Because these changes that I mentioned are really for the whole power market. But it also created a sort of cap and trade system where you trade clean energy certificates. And it requires industries with larger consumption of over 1 megawatt to generate at least 5% of energy from renewables in 2018, with that share increasing to almost 14% in 2022. So in these auctions, as this chart also shows, a lot of clean energy certificates were awarded. So this is another mechanism for promoting cleaner energy. It also reiterated the existing targets. Mexico already had a target of 35% of power from clean sources by 2024. It sort of reconfirmed that, and it also created interim goals. So the country has very specific goals in this area. And in addition, it created the Geothermal Energy Act. This was also part of the whole reform process, which created a framework for private companies to develop resources, and it facilitated issuing of permits for site studies. So it created some incentives for geothermal specifically. So I don't think that the reform really addressed all of the problems. So another issue that I discussed in the chapter is there are still ongoing challenges. And this was, of course, before the new government took over. So I think the main areas that still needed to be worked on, one is that the power grid is still in very poor condition because of underinvestment. So, technical and non-technical losses went down dramatically over the last couple of years, but they're still above the OECD average, which is more where Mexico would like to be. So the OECD average is, around 7%. In Mexico, it's still over 11% of losses. And most of the wind and solar, so let me just skip to this map. So this sort of shows the electrical grid. Most of the wind and solar resources are in the sort of northwest region, desert regions for solar, in Oaxaca on the Pacific coast for wind. But the demand tends to be more where you see the sort of grid, the southeast, the industrial centers, the population centers. So you really need to invest in, firming up the existing transmission lines and reducing losses, but you also need to build some new transmission lines. And that's something that I think was, we're not there yet. There was this opportunity for private investment, but it hasn't really happened yet. And so, also the regulatory authorities have to make sure that there's a system that covers peak demand, that provides reliability, and that still can provide low costs. And the second, I would say, sort of challenge is that the country still relies a lot on competition from natural gas. So, the matrix is really doesn't have as much renewables to start with as many other Latin American countries. So there's a lot of imports coming in of gas from the United States, which compete with renewables. And some of the bids in the renewable auctions, as I mentioned before, you have these really low prices, but there was also a lot of concern that the prices offered maybe were too low. In some cases, they didn't do the right analysis, and maybe they weren't going to be able to get financing. And another variable is that there wasn't enough of a sort of social and environmental impact assessment. So, it's still, I think, unclear to what extent they can really compete, renewables can really compete with natural gas. And then also, over time, there's been an increase. In this chart, you can't even see solar because it's so insignificant. Wind, you can see it's the bottom. There's a little bit of an increase, but we're starting from a really low point. We do have more hydro in Mexico, but interestingly, the auctions really, the technologies that did the best were solar and wind. So that's where, we're seeing a lot of new potential. And then finally, I think the other challenge that hasn't been addressed, or that wasn't really addressed under the reform adequately, is local communities. There's a lot of opposition, just like you have in oil and mining projects. You have a lot of opposition from local communities in renewable energy projects. And even though Mexico it requires the Energy Ministry to hold consultations. It has signed the ILO 169 Convention on Free and Informed Prior Consent. It requires developers to do a social impact assessment, yet you still have a lot of conflicts. And one of the things that makes it more complicated in Mexico is the ejido model, or the social property model, where land is co-owned. It could be hundreds of people that you have to negotiate. You don't just have one landowner that you have to negotiate with. So that just makes it more complicated. And there have been cases, there was a case of a wind project that was canceled by a ruling by the Supreme Court because they said they hadn't gone through the proper consultation process. So that brings me to a few thoughts on what changes have happened since the current government took over. So I think that one big approach of the new government has been, I think, a sort of review of and skepticism toward activities that involve private companies. So as was mentioned earlier, the suspension or cancellation of both power generation and transmission auctions. So what should have been the fourth long-term renewable power auction was canceled, was initially postponed in December. I mean, as you brought up, it wasn't as clear immediately that this was going to be a sort of area for target, and I thought that it was just a temporary postponement and a sort of let's do this on our watch by the new government. But in fact, in February, it was canceled sort of indefinitely, and this would have it was expected to bring 1,400 megawatt hours of electricity capacity, $1.6 billion in investment. And also, interestingly, there was an expectation that the CFE would further reduce its stake. So a lot of others would be off-takers, even more than that little 9% from the third auction. But I don't think it's been totally clarified, why it was canceled. One advisor said that the government is still evaluating the benefits of the long-term generation auctions and setting up an industry working group to get feedback, so they're sort of still reviewing it. But I think, it looked like it wasn't just a temporary postponement. And in addition to that, some of the transmission line auctions have been canceled. So, for example, in January, a transmission line that was going to be built from Oaxaca was canceled. They said it was because of a financial analysis confirmed that the project was not a priority for the government, and it would have taken wind power from that region to central Mexico, which, as I said, is very important. I think the other focus of the new government is strengthening CFE and a return to state-led development. So it's very similar to what we see in the oil sector, the idea of strengthening Pemex. So there was a budgetary increase for CFE of 12% in the recently presented budget. And this will help a little bit. I mean, there is an issue of a shortage of funds for CFE, but it's not going to ever be significant enough to make up for what would have come in private capital for the power sector and for renewables in particular. And then I think the third sort of new focus of the government is a focus on expanding domestic resources. There's more of a focus, I think, on coal, oil, domestic natural gas, and large hydro. And there's a move away from, non-hydro renewable sources. So I think one of the objectives is of course to reduce dependence on natural gas imports from the U.S. And the government presented a plan to modernize 60 domestic thermal plants using coal, oil, and gas, retrofitting existing plants, even proposing building a new coal plant. So, there's definitely a shift in the direction. And I think with the previous government, there was still a lot of use of natural gas. Renewables were still, as I said, making up a small share. So moving even further away from that is, I think, a big change. There was also an increase in the budget for Pemex, an increase in the budget for the Energy Ministry, especially focused on the hydrocarbons subsecretariat, and a reduction of some important parts of the budget, some programs for clean energy, for energy efficiency, for ASEA, the environment regulator, for the Environment Ministry. These all see budget cuts, as well as the regulators, the pt1 and the CNH. And there are reports that their workforce will be reduced. There was a proposal to put the regulators under the Energy Ministry and for them to lose some of their independence. So I think those are sort of the main changes that we're seeing, based on what's happened over the last couple of months. So finally, as with all the chapters, mine includes some recommendations, and I think that I would still give the same recommendations, but now I would maybe have to add some more. I think overall my recommendation was the reform created a good framework for expanding renewables. So work with that framework and make some tweaks to improve it. So one recommendation was increase the capacity and efficiency of the energy transmission and distribution system. So I think natural gas and hydropower will certainly continue to be important for baseload power, but you can also increase the intermittent renewable energy sources, and this actually they're domestic sources of power, so this helps with energy security and with reliability, and it's clearly they're competitive as well. And I think now I would say, the government should resume these transmission auctions in order to access private capital to expand and upgrade the grid. A lot more could be done to promote distributed generation in both urban areas through, smart metering, in rural areas where you need off-grid solutions. A plan to develop energy storage for intermittent energy, and maintaining the independence of the regulators, the SENACE and the pt1 in this case. Another recommendation would be resume and improve the clean energy auction. So, move forward with the fourth auction. And I think to avoid the possibility of underbidding, more could be done to demand financial guarantees and go with bidders with strong technical and financial qualifications. The government could provide more information about the renewable energy potential in certain areas, and also provide more information about the social and environmental conditions in those areas to make it easier for developers to avoid things like conflicts or poor environmental impact assessments that don't get approved. Some of the really less established technologies like geothermal and ocean energy may need temporary subsidies that should be phased out over time. More could be done to incentivize the local renewable energy industry for components and for services, and for example, clean energy clusters. And then I also think that more could be done to improve the process for local consultation. So as in other countries, the most important thing I think for avoiding local conflicts is putting resources toward talking with communities and having a process that's clear, that communities understand, what the outcome will be, what their role is, and having enough actual people from the government and having the government actually proactively involved in consultations. Looking at other examples in Latin America, that's really been the most successful approach. So I think, I think looking back, it's something that I wrote about a year ago. I think it's, I would still say the same thing, but I think that there's been some backtracking and actually more now needs to be done. So that concludes my chapter.
Thank you, Lisa. A lot to come back to and discuss there, particularly in terms of some of the change. I think the questioning of the electricity model is something that has been quite interesting as this government took office in the last 90 or so days and how they've approached it. So let me now turn to a crude reform, Pemex in Mexico's New Energy Landscape, which was a chapter co-authored by Noel Maurer and Leticia Abad. And I think Noel is going to go first and begin to share with us, well, just where we are in terms of this crude reform.
All right, so first I want to thank Jeremy for moderating the panel. I want to thank Duncan for putting it together. I want to thank Lisa. That was a very edifying, great presentation. I definitely want to thank my co-author for providing most of the interesting and new stuff in this paper. And I also want to thank all of you for showing up and having your forbearance, especially in terms of listening to us, because until I hand the mic over to my co-author, like Duncan, one thing we have in common is that we both speak the King's English, except in my case, it's Kings County, Brooklyn. And I want to apologize in advance for anyone who has trouble understanding me or if I speak too quickly, because I don't know how long I have to live. So to start, I just want to put the energy reform in context. The energy reform came in the context of plunging output in the case of Pemex. So this is a very long-term view of Mexican oil production all the way from 1900 up until around last month. And as you can see, there was a massive decline starting in the beginning of the 21st century and certainly continuing. At the same time, the National Oil Company was in increasing financial straits. This graph here shows Pemex's revenues in 2017 pesos from 2001 through 2017. Its expenses are in red, and so you can see, and these are expenses before taxes. And so as you can see, with the decline in oil prices, they started to plunge, and in fact, the company lost money in 2015. But more to the point, even during a period where oil prices were off exploring Mars, Pemex's profitability was not rising high enough for the company to be able to make any money given its massive tax burden. So the oil company was in trouble. Mexico had reserves of hydrocarbons that needed to be developed. The company didn't have the resources to do it, and so the energy reform was intended to try and solve that problem. And so what we're going to do right here is I'm going to briefly talk about what the energy reform in theory was trying to do and whether or not it succeeded in practice before turning the mic over to Leticia to discuss how we think the new administration is actually going to affect the way the reforms are going to work out in the future. So one way to think about it is the reforms really intended to try and ease three constraints that Pemex were facing, and this is going to be a very Pemex-focused presentation. The first are financial. Essentially, the company needed investment capital to be able to develop Mexico's hydrocarbon resources as well as properly manage its existing fields. The second was fiscal. The company suffered a very, very, very massive tax burden that in fact was driving the company into the red almost continuously and also provided a big chunk of resources for the federal government. And the final one was sort of human capital. The company was not, shall we say, the most efficient oil company on the planet, and that there were some issues and problems with the way Pemex was managed. So the way in which the reforms attempted to address the financial constraint was via the farm-outs. You can think of them as joint ventures. It's a little bit more complicated than that. I don't want to get into the weeds too much right here because of time. The thing to keep in mind is that the farm-outs were almost always sideshows. There was a lot of heat, but not a whole lot of light. This here is Pemex production from 2010 up to 2018. So those are real numbers from 18 to 25. Those are projections. This is the big KMZ offshore fields. These are Pemex's other fields. And these up here are the farm outs, which were expected to maybe kind of sort of, if everything goes right, knock on plastic, maybe might have made up for some of the decline. There were other farm outs, but this really always was, in some extent, given way too much attention as a way of sort of solving at least Pemex's problems. Just to give one example here, the Trion field has a break-even price of about $53. So even if everything does go as planned, it's not going to generate a huge influx of free cash flow for Pemex. Pemex has discovered other fields, but there's still the question of how do you get the money to develop them? And even they're marginal. The second thing the reform did is it chopped taxes immensely. So essentially, These three lines here, this gold lines are just the oil price, just to give you some background information. These three lines show Pemex's tax burden as a percentage of the company's revenues, as a percentage of the government's total tax take, and as a percentage of Mexico's GDP. At the very end of this presentation, we're going to return to that last line. But as you can see, around the time of the reform in 14 and 15, these dropped amazingly. There were actually massive tax cuts. But there's two things to keep in mind. The first is that tax cuts are a second, or the tax burden was a second order problem. I mean, this is a company that was losing money. You can kind of watch here the collapse in Pemex's free cash flow after 2010. That's basically that blue line there. This is a company that was in financial trouble before it got hit with this immense tax burden. So yes, it's helpful, it's nice, it's necessary, but it's not a panacea, and it doesn't get at the main problem. So then we turn over to sort of, again, the issue of human capital. And here you had massive layoffs. So this red line is the percentage of the workforce that's unionized. This blue line is the head count. You can see here in 2015 and 2016, it dropped immensely. One might want to note that many of the proponents of the reform stated explicitly in the run-up that that was not going to happen. And we're going to return to the point Jeremy made in his comments about how this reform was oversold a bit later in this presentation. But even this kind of drop in the head count didn't do a whole lot to reduce Pemex's payroll as a percentage of its revenue. And there were two reasons for this. One is revenue collapsed because oil prices collapsed. But the second one is this was always a little bit overblown as a problem. Yes, around the margins, Pemex is overstaffed. Absolutely. There's no doubt of that. Pemex employees are paid a lot by Mexican standards. This is the average wage in Mexico. We measured it two ways. I won't get too much into the weeds. These are average Pemex wages. Yes, they continue to increase quite dramatically over this period. But at the end of the day, Pemex employees are paid a lot less than international standards. The company's payroll is not that elevated. And while there are a lot of complaints that we hear about the company's internal management structure not providing incentives to employees to do a good job, I at least am very skeptical that those matter. This insight actually is Leticia's. If you look at other state-owned companies, YPF in particular, but Petrobras as well, their employees are poached by the majors all the bloody time. Even if there isn't an internal structure to give you a bonus for, say, discovering a new field or managing a great deal, if you do a good job, you can make a lot of money by jumping ship. This doesn't happen with Pemex employees, which makes us think that the issue is not really the incentives that the employees as individuals or the managers as individuals are facing. It's the strategic direction of the company. The problem is at a much higher pay grade than the one that some of these administrative reforms were attempting to address. My co-author is going to talk a little bit more about corruption a little bit later. And that brings us around, before I hand the mic off, to the point that Jeremy raised. And again, apologies if I'm speaking too quickly, which is that the reform was oversold. President Peña Nieto essentially took advantage of a split in the left to try and push through this Pacto para México, this broad group of reforms. Energy reform was shoehorned on top of that, shoved through in a party line vote where you basically had the PRI and the PAN voting for it, and they could buy votes from those, pardon me, I can say this, right, those parties like the Green Party that really aren't political parties. They're ways to earn rents. Buy them off, push this through, make all these extravagant promises, which in the electricity sector, as Lisa's presentation showed, you might have been able to follow through on and show benefits to average Mexicans, but in hydrocarbons just wasn't going to happen. And then when you count that the reforms are kind of like, they're not all that great, and they didn't really work all that well on their own count. So AMLO could give these presentations about how Pemex investment budget is still collapsing and output is still going down, and none of the benefits are showing up. You had a population, we're not even going to talk about the gasolinazo, that was sort of primed for being angry and disillusioned with these reforms. They were on very shaky political ground. And just to add to that, Americans in particular tend to over-focus on the idea that this is a constitutional amendment, forgetting that the Mexican Constitution, since its inception in 1917, has been amended on average 5 times a year. This is not as big a barrier as someone with an American or a Canadian or a French perspective might actually think. And with that, I want to hand the mic over to my co-author to talk about AMLO.
Thank you. So to make your money worth, we just decided to extend our analysis to cover what has happened since we finished the chapter last April. And we just want to put this into perspective and just, have the same kind of framework analysis of having these three main points, or like the three main constraints that Pemex faces in terms of easing like the financial part of it, then in terms of the tax burden, and also addressing inefficiencies. As many of you here in the audience know, like the energy sector is a top priority for the new president, and he has been very vocal, even this morning, like in his daily press conferences about what the role of Pemex should be in the Mexican economy. He claims that Pemex should be a strategic unit in the whole Mexican state. He also pledged to reverse this, like as my co-author has shown, this really dramatic collapse in oil production. He claims that Pemex is going to be, the oil production overall is going to increase 40% by 2024. That is magic, and 50% in terms of natural gas. So there's been a lot of resources and talk about like what Pemex want to do. And in the last couple of weeks, we have seen a rescue package that is addressing supposedly some of these concerns that we have raised in our chapter. And I'm going to take a little bit of time to explain how all this how this rescue package fits into Pemex and how is easing or not these constraints that we have pointed out before. So, the first thing that we want to talk about is that, as many of you may know, or maybe this is shocking to me to hear this, and I'm from Argentina, so macroeconomic things do not shock me that much, is that Pemex has the title of the most indebted oil company in the world. The interesting part about that is that given the revenue and the size of this company, the debt repayment should not be an issue. The problem is they're an issue because of the cost structure of the company. And this rescue package, what is allowing Pemex to do, supposedly, is to give it some breathing room. It's going to allow Pemex not to go to the market, especially, and I'll talk a little bit later, given that the market is not very happy with Pemex lately. That's kind of an understatement. So in this sense, the rescue package supposedly is going to give some breathing room to the company. The problem is that it's not enough. It's kind of, I'm going to the doctor because I have some coronary diseases. Okay, here's a Band-Aid. Maybe just you're going to do well with that. So that is one of the parts of the rescue package. The second part that supposedly is going to ease the constraints is the question of farm outs. And as Duncan has pointed out, there's a huge uncertainty about the future of that. Some of them have been canceled. We know that the new president is not really keen on having foreign capital helping Mexico overall, and is very protective to Pemex about that. However, according to some sources, as of last week, supposedly the auctions for October are still on, even though there were talks that they were not going to be on, and López Obrador has said that he wants these auctions to be extended if we can see actual results, which is not clear what it be. But as my co-author has pointed before, this is not going to actually be major in terms of the bottom line for the company overall. And that brings us to the second part of the rescue package. And to put it into context, we just want to show you, like this is from the Secretaría de Hacienda that was released a couple of weeks ago. So for those of you that do not read Spanish, I can just easily translate. So basically, we have that one of the key components to it supposedly is to reduce the tax burden. It's not reducing the tax burden, it's allowing the company to use some new deductions in order to release some revenue. to use supposedly for capitalization. But if you just put it into perspective, this is only just 4% of the annual liabilities that the company faces. So it's not really that substantial. But when you just look at it, it's like, hey, these are billions of pesos or billions of dollars. Billions of dollars actually do not like as impressive. But millions of pesos seems that is a lot of money. But relative to the size of the company, this is not really that substantial. And the markets have noticed this. So the markets have not been happy. So overall, the analysts have said that I think the most favorable quote I found was, it's not clear this is a silver bullet. That was the most favorable one. Two scathing reviews from JP Morgan, it's like, we're so disappointed, we just want to leave, pretty much. So in terms of from the market's perspective, we also see the weakening of the peso. We saw an increase in yields for the Pemex bonds. So the market said, like, this is not enough. We were expecting, some of the analysts said they were expecting at least double the package that has been introduced, this is the details that we have. We don't know exactly the really details how this is going to be accomplished and for how long, supposedly. The rating agencies have not been happy either. Fitch has downgraded the Pemex bonds to a notch above junk food, as I call it. Once again, Argentina, not fun to be in the junk bond territory, not fun. So when you're just busy playing at that limit is really troublesome. And the virus keeps on spreading. As of yesterday, Standard & Poor's changed the outlook for Pemex to negative, and now this contagion effect goes to other companies like insurance companies. Even Coca-Cola in Mexico is seeing according to Standard & Poor's, a negative outlook. So this is actually worrisome. And also, just to join the unhappiness party, we have the IMF. But once again, Argentina, the IMF is never happy. I have never seen the IMF happy, so I'm going to discount that. So we have all this unhappiness geared towards Pemex, even though López Obrador said that whatever it takes, he will do, and the government will do, in order to rescue this company. But this is whatever it will do so far. So finally, what we want to talk about a little bit more is, well, this is the rescue package, but there's more. There's one particular reform and one particular policy that both Duncan and Jeremy have referred to, is about fuel theft. And this has been popular because of some accident that happened like a few weeks ago, and very graphic pictures that you can see of people lining up in order to get gas, which make me flashbacks of when you are in a hyperinflationary situation or in Venezuela, right? So this is not what you think about Mexico, and has been troublesome to actually witness that. So supposedly by sending troops to, according to the estimates, 15,000 troops in order to prevent fuel theft. This has actually resulted in really successful curbing of fuel theft. It has some side effects, like there's no gas in some places, but this has been supposedly effective. The question is how sustainable it is. Like, if you're thinking as a government where you have troops, we can, combat other problems that Mexico will have, is the government really wanted to devote these forces for how long? Because according to some of the specialists that we consulted when we were in Mexico a couple of weeks ago, they say once the troops retreat, this is going to be a problem forever. So it's not clear that it's going to address them, even though we welcome this. But it's not really going to make Pemex's bottom line better overall. So this is really not. But what is more interesting to us is supposedly AMLO just ran into an anti-corruption platform. And this should be one of the places where he could put a lot of effort and resources in order to curb corruption overall. As of today, and I quote, like in the press, I just got this quote, he said here, and I translate it loosely, "We're going to rescue Pemex. My optimism is based on what technocrats say, a variable." Is that referring to us? We are the technocrats, I guess. One variable. And he says that he's going to like eliminate corruption. Now, the corruption he's talking about is, unfortunately, the huachicoleo, but if you just, we spent a lot of time reading the ASF report that was talking about 2017, so we don't even know what happened in 2018 yet. The suspense is killing me. It seems that the Pemex behavior overall has been really, really brought to the light about this result, and it was incredibly honest about the situation of Pemex, saying that their system of data collection doesn't say that it actually is responsible for the fuel theft, but created a favorable environment for fuel theft. There are other red flags that have been raised in this report. Like, for example, it takes 70.7 days for Pemex to pay its suppliers. The Salina Cruz refinery that was hit by many, many unfortunate events, after many contracts over, the goal was to get 70% of capacity and is right now at 39.6%. The illegal tappings, that we know are not really combat within the system. And we have other flops like the fertilizer unit and the cogeneration ventures as well. So overall, what we see is that this regulatory package is within this umbrella that we think about the AMLO administration. However, that's not really going to change radically Pemex performance or future performance as well. And with that, I'm going to turn back to my co-author so that we just look at the big picture.
So the only thing that we want to end on, and we talked about this, whether or not we should even do this at the end, but we figured we'd take advantage of the platform that we have, is just to point out that while Pemex is too big to fail in the sense that you've got 130,000 employees, and right now its bond rating is tied up with the bond rating of the Mexican federal government, Mexico does not need Pemex. And in the medium term, 5 years, 10 years, certainly, Mexico does not even really need an oil industry anymore. Mexico has graduated from being an oil country to a country that happens to have a lot of oil. Over here, you've got Mexican federal budgets from 2001 over to 2017. As a percentage of GDP, revenue from hydrocarbons is this blue line here. It's down to less than 2% of GDP. It is a small and shrinking part of the federal budget. It would be very easy for the Mexican federal government to make up these revenues. This orange line down here, these are retail taxes on hydrocarbons. This line goes negative because for a while the Mexican government incomprehensibly was subsidizing people to basically set stuff on fire. That stopped. But these revenues could be made up for. And so while you have a company that's too big to fail, it's not something, and I think it behooves all of us to keep this in perspective, that this is something, a decline, a failing company, but just managing its failure in a way to reduce the human cost is a very viable option for Mexico. And it is surprising to both of us how little you hear that, because that is something that is talked about in other contexts, in other countries, and other industries. The final thing just to end, to point out, and this gets back to Lisa's presentation, is that certainly in electricity and the renewable sector, renewables are super competitive. Mexico is sitting on immense resources. The competitiveness of those resources increases by the minute as wind turbines get larger and more efficient and solar photovoltaic cells fall in price. Just to give some example, these lines are the projections of the International Energy Agency about how much wind power and solar power is going, in this case, this graph is solar, is going to be installed every year. And essentially every year they decide that the second derivative must have fallen to zero, and whatever was happening in that year is just going to continue, and the annual increments are going to be flat. And every year these guys, don't ask me how and don't ask me why, are taken by surprise by the fact that solar and wind installations, and more to the point, the actual generation of megawatt hours is far more than they anticipated. So for a number of different reasons, fiscal independence, the growth of the non-oil economy, and the fact that alternative energy sources, as Lisa pointed out, are becoming increasingly competitive and will blow hydrocarbons out of the water 5 years down the line, mean that failure actually is a very real option and something that we think should be on the table, and I think is when you actually look at what the ratings agencies are saying. And with that, I'd like to hand the mic back over to Jeremy. Thank you.
Well, you didn't incentivize any kind of debate with that ending there, did you at all? Wow. But first, we'll wrap up the formal part of the panel with Duncan Wood. And Duncan, please, your thoughts, and perhaps we can get into exactly, so just let Pemex fail or not. But I don't know if you want to address that or
Thank you. And thank you, Noel, for throwing controversy right in our faces.
Yeah.
I think we've got a lot to talk about there. Instead of making a full presentation of what the chapter that Jeremy and I wrote together was all about, or what the book, I'd like to first of all mention, thank you the authors, everybody who participated in this book project, because it was a labor of love, and sometimes not so much love, but and there are a number of authors who aren't with us today, and so let me just mention them. In particular, Sarah Ladislaw and Jesse Barnett, who wrote a fine chapter on the global energy system. The idea was to put Mexico's energy sector in the context of that. Guillermo Garcia Sanchez, who is a professor at Texas A&M University Law School, and Peter Nance, who wrote a very, very fine chapter in this book on Mexico's electricity reform. It's the longest of the chapters, largely because he put in a ton of graphics. And the graphics are the reason why the book is this shape, not a regular book shape, because otherwise we wouldn't have been able to see the details of the graphics. So thank you to the authors and, of course, the people who are here with us today. But I want to actually pick up on what Noel said, and let's get straight into the argument about this. Mexico doesn't need Pemex, okay? It's not the point, is it? AMLO needs Pemex. Andrés Manuel needs Pemex. And I think he has created this idea that Pemex is fundamentally important to the bienestar, to the welfare of the nation, and it's not just the prosperity of the nation. I think one of the biggest mistakes that we make is criticizing Andrés Manuel López Obrador for not understanding economics or not understanding an economic logic. He may or may not, but it's secondary for him. His fundamental concern is political. And Pemex has always been a fine political symbol for Mexico. And here's where I would sort of delve into the chapter that Jeremy and I wrote together on the history of the reform, which is, let's go back, not just to 2012, but let's go back to the end of the 1990s, the early 2000s, and think about what Mexican public opinion said about the possibility of opening up the sector. Yeah. Time and time again, when Mexicans were asked, do you want to see private and foreign investment in the oil and gas sector, they said no. Mexicans didn't feel comfortable with it. I always had an idea that maybe that was soft, that you could manipulate it. And various polls which came out during the reform suggested that was indeed the case. But I'll never forget, and I've mentioned this many times over the years, there was a poll that was taken by CIDE, Mexican Attitudes Towards the World, México en el Mundo. And there were two questions in that poll which really stood out, and this was around 2006, 2007. One of the questions was, would you agree to full integration with the United States of America if it would lead to a rise in your personal prosperity, if it would make you better off? And a small majority of Mexicans said yes to that question. They said, yeah, we'll integrate entirely with the United States if it means that if I have more money. But later on in the same survey, they asked the question, Pemex is in trouble, it's not producing as much oil production is collapsing. Do you think we should allow private and foreign investment in the sector? And 80% of Mexicans said no. So if you put those two questions together, the answer is obvious. Mexicans will sell their country before they will sell their oil. Now, since we have all been so heavily engaged in talking about the energy reform for the past 6 years, and I think most of us here are fans of the reform. We think that it was not a perfect reform by any stretch of the imagination, but it was a positive step forward. I think we kind of lost sight of the fact that Mexicans were never really convinced by the reform. Opinion polls showed us that. And Andrés Manuel, although this wasn't the issue that won him the election, right, he was very astute in recognizing that Mexicans feel something for their national oil company. When I was at ITAM many years ago, I had a student who wrote a thesis on Pemex and sovereignty. And sure enough, what did we see 2 weeks ago? A new slogan for Pemex, which was it Pemex El Rescate de la Soberanía? Rescuing sovereignty. That explicit connection between sovereignty, Pemex, the energy sector. I think that's what really matters at this point in time for Andrés Manuel. And I don't know whether he believes that you can bring Pemex production up by the end of the sexennial to 2.5, 2.6 million barrels a day. Maybe he does believe it. But again, I would say that that is kind of secondary importance. It's the project. It's about building the refinery. It's about investing in Pemex. It's about being able to show off a new oil rig. It's about being able to say, we're actually making progress. This is not just a one sexennial project. I think we have to accept that. As I said at the beginning, so much has happened in the first 3 months of this administration that we think, wow, it's been an incredible journey so far. It's just beginning. And this is going to continue way beyond 2024, if you ask me. And so when we bring it back and we think about what it is that is at stake here, it's not just, can you not just see the logic of this? Do you not understand that Pemex is losing money? It's about, no, this is symbolic. Yeah. This is historical. This is about what the people want. And I think if we begin to think of it in those terms, then we begin to put it in the right context and begin to understand why Andrés Manuel is doing what he is. And I'll just leave it there.
Well, it's a fascinating point, and I think we can come back to in several of these. And I mean, one of the things when Peña Nieto signed the reform law, he said, we have now moved beyond myths and taboos. But have we? I mean, what Duncan has outlined is exactly, the icon. And if you look at the new imagery of this government, it's all about icons, right? I mean, look at, you just see these wonderful images from leaders of the past. And of course, we haven't mentioned yet the fourth transformation. And so I think to allow Pemex to fail does not play well into the fourth transformation. I would suggest probably fairly straightforwardly here. There's a whole host of things to get into, not just whether Pemex can move on or not. But I think this question of, okay, so Pemex is not going to fail. There's no way this government's going to let it fail. Then let's get into what will happen. And because if we've seen the cancellation of the oil and gas contracts, but yet we've seen forward progress on service contracts, and we've seen the effort to bring in Mexican drilling companies to work together. I mean, there's a lot of activity being generated, right? Pemex is really starting to ramp up its drilling activity on the back of Mexican drilling contracts and service contracts. There's a whole host of service contracts, 114 or something, I forget the exact number. But then the question becomes, and everyone we asked at a panel that the Institute of the Americas did last week, do those lead to that 600,000-700,000 barrel a day recovery? And nobody said yes. So we come back to where we always seem to come back to. Okay, we all agree it's politically important. We agree that the efforts to combat Huachicoleo was not necessarily an energy strategy. It was a public opinion strategy, and it was part of the anti-corruption. And I'm going to root out all of these people who've been harming our populace. But then you still come to the bottom line of you have to perform on Wall Street as a company. You have to deliver results, Pemex, for the nation at some point in time if you are continuing with this commitment. Anyway, I'm belaboring the point, and so let me start with the question. Well, why don't we open it up? What do you think? Because I think we've been talking a lot up here. So if anyone wants to, how do you want to do this, Duncan? Should we just open it up to the floor here and if everyone's very timid, I'll come up with some questions, but let's see. Let's see if the audience has any insights or questions. Sir.
Hi, Brian Scheid with S&P Global Platts. You talked a little bit about how you see this $2.4 to $2.6 million barrel per day goal as unrealistic. What do you think as the realistic goals for Pemex? What will they be producing in a year, 2 years' time?
You have a slide that I think, I think you had some numbers, right, Noel?
Yes, we did. So this is the middle projection for the existing auction field. So by 2025, in theory, they're supposed to be producing 750,000 barrels a day. That is an extremely rapid ramp up and is unlikely to be met. The Energy Ministry puts 400,000 barrels a day by 2025 as their low scenario. it seems plausible. But do note, these are the auction fields. These are not farm outs. These are not directly involved with Pemex. These are the fields that, at least if you read the way the fourth transformation seems to be playing out, the revenue from those fields, and as much as there is any, is going to be used to cross-subsidize Pemex and keep it schlumping along. And so one other thing about Jeremy and Duncan's comments is that I don't think we disagree at all. I just think most of us in this room probably would take success for reforming Pemex as putting the company on a stable footing going ahead and having production goals that can be met and getting its finances stable. The fourth transformation does not intend to do that. Yeah. In another country at another time where Pemex really was vital to national health, that would not be an option. You would not be able to have this giant political project because the country would not be able to afford it. But Mexico can. Mexico can afford to keep this behemoth schlumping along with some sorts of cross-subsidization, in part from the parts of the energy reform that have already gone ahead that won't be turned away, and in part perhaps by spending taxpayer dollars on it. What we would call failure, he would call success, and that is actually a very real option. Pemex does not, to some extent, need to be fixed. It's not a national crisis or an existential threat for Mexico, its polity, or its economy.
If I can just, chime in there. We're currently at 1.623. I think this is the latest figure, right? 1.623 million barrels a day. Pemex just revised downwards its own predictions for what it's going to produce by the end of this year, but Pemex is still saying that they're going to produce, I think, 1.77 by the end of the year. I don't quite see where those extra barrels are coming from. The estimate of 750,000 barrels a day from the contracts, I think that's incredibly ambitious. Folks that I spoke to in the industry suggested that it would be more like 250, maybe 300 by 2024. So if you think that you're going to add 300, let's be generous. Let's say it's 300 that we add, and then we get what will be the decline on the existing fields. It's going to be pretty significant. Anything that Pemex does from this point on, if it's not taking existing fields and injecting nitrogen into them or trying to increase production from them, then that will take a long time to pay off. So it's probably beyond the term of this sexennium. So I think we can realistically think that we are going to be stuck at around 1.6 by the end of the sexennium. Maybe we get up to 1.8 if Pemex is able to hold the line on 1.6 itself, and then you add in an extra 200, 300,000. But we're not. I can't see us breaking the 2 million barrel a day mark by the end of the sexennium.
Well, then I think you mentioned, the role of the private, the contracts that were let as part of the reform, right? And I know we're going to hear from the industry association, Merlin Cochran, later today about the role of the industry itself. And I think an interesting thing to consider here is, and maybe Merlin can speak to this later, one of the things in postponing or canceling the upcoming oil auctions that were scheduled, the president said, because I want to wait to see, and I'm going to put pressure on the contracts that are already let to produce and increase their production and ramp up their production and bring it online quicker. So 2 questions there. One, is that even realistic? And number 2, does it change materially what you guys just got done talking about? So things to mull over. Let me throw it out, but I also want to come back to Lisa or Duncan. You guys have your name cat for our web audience. I don't know if
We're
they're
interchangeable.
I looked over and I said, wait a second. Let me throw it over to
Duncan just got a lot more attractive. That's what you were thinking, right? There you go.
Well, exactly. The issue of the challenges, and by the way, the challenges of the electric sector are similar in most countries when you come into the losses and all these. But this idea of the need to make more resilient and robust the transmission network, right? And then we saw the cancellation of 2 major auctions, or not auctions, but projects that were going to be developed at really no cost to the government because they were a PPP model, a concession type model. So my question for Lisa is, how does Mexico's electric grid become more robust and allow for a much better aprovechamiento of those renewable resources at the same time that we see some backsliding on infrastructure development?
Well, I think things are going to go backward in terms of the amount of investment, and I think similarly to the oil sector, it's largely symbolic.
Yeah.
The like you said, I don't think that the economic I don't think the issue is that economically it doesn't make sense to, put this in the hands of a private company. I think it's part of a broader policy of putting things, of a state-led development, of putting things in the hands of the state companies, and being very skeptical of the idea of private companies handling it. And so I think, increasing CFE's budget by 12% is not going to be enough to allow them to make the investments that they need to make in the grid. And you still have the issue of subsidies. I mean, I think we were discussing that the reform was oversold. I do think that it was oversold in the electricity sector as well, because there were promises about people's electricity rates going down. But in reality, residential rates are so heavily subsidized for most people that even if the costs of power generation and transmission and distribution decline, you're still not going to see that change in your bill if your bill was subsidized. So I think that, and so that means that those liabilities are still there for the CFE. So I think if they don't go ahead with these auctions, it's going to be very difficult to make all of the investments that are needed. But I also don't think that developing renewables is a priority for this government. Right. So I don't think they're too concerned about it. I think their focus is hydro, yes, definitely a big focus on expanding hydro, largely kind of expanding capacity in existing dams and expanding natural gas production and coal production. And I think if intermittent renewables, I think they're skeptical of intermittent renewables anyway. So if the investments aren't made for that to increase, then I think that they see that as fine.
Sorry, Jeremy, on that one, I think I have to say, I think that the government's really missing a beat on this one, on the renewables argument, because if they are truly serious about energy sovereignty, energy security, why wouldn't you invest heavily in this?
That was something you and I talked about last year. I thought that the idea of domestic resources could include very easily a focus on renewable development. It would be able to, in a medium to longer term, displace some of the gas imports. If you want to reduce your gas imports for power generation, what better way than wind and solar from all over your country?
And instead, we've heard reports about increasing coal imports into Mexico.
So let me ask everyone here. I mean, were you surprised? I mean, I think none of us are surprised the posture on the oil and gas and Pemex. I mean, let's just be honest, right? Nothing in the big picture has surprised us but the posture. On the electric sector, has this been surprising?
Yes, I mean, I thought that it was less of a political hot potato, so I thought that it would sort of go under the radar and that they would continue with previous policies without making big disruptive changes like in the oil sector. So I think it's surprising to see such a backtracking. I mean, throughout López Obrador's career, I don't think he's paid some lip service to environmental issues, but I don't think that it's been a priority. I think his priority has been more economic and more, nationalist. So in that sense, it's not a surprise that renewables wouldn't be a priority. But I did think that just sort of maintaining the status quo would have been politically acceptable, and that's what I would have expected.
I was stunned by it. My logic is exactly the same as yours. And to just draw a parallel with another jurisdiction that's highly nationalistic and sort of has a bad view of foreigners, the state of Texas, where Rick Perry managed that famous green to sell out a $7 billion program, the CREZ program, to build these high-voltage direct current power lines across the state to allow the build-out of Texas's wind industry, even though that was going to be financed by higher electricity charges that the ISO was going to pass on to consumers. But when you read it, we're Texas, we have our own grid, ERCOT, we're independent from the rest of it, this is wind power made in Texas, and even though we're big on oil and gas, we're also big on Texas and Texan and Texas and Texas.
Anyone from Texas?
Perry could do it.
Yes, we'll hear from.
We love Texas.
Sound like a good New Yorker.
Your best friends are from Texas.
Some of my best friends are Texan.
Yeah.
So I'm sort of surprised. I am surprised. I don't fully understand. I understand the oil industry's iconic nature. I don't fully understand why that didn't happen.
I guess maybe we shouldn't have been as soon as we learned who was the nominee or the gentleman put in charge of CFE. Perhaps maybe we should have better understood. Please, yes, back to the audience. And I want to come back to fracking as well. We can't end this panel without talking about fracking.
The gentleman from Texas.
Hi, my name's Jay Applewhite. I live in Austin, Texas.
That doesn't count.
Sure it does. And I lived 20 years abroad in South America as well. So thank you for the invitation, Duncan, who's spoken at some of our events in San Antonio. We also do one in Monterrey, both focused on the energy sector in Mexico. So my question is, do you think there's a confusion or misunderstanding of what is energy security versus sovereignty? Are those two things getting intertwined? Because I feel like I've defended the oil and gas sector to my friends in Mexico with you can have energy security built out by foreign privates. It doesn't mean you're giving away your sovereignty. And so do you feel like there's some confusion by the administration or some intertwining of those two concepts that's working as a headwind against, obviously, what is energy security?
Well, I'll throw in there self-sufficiency, because I think part of what you also hear in the narrative is self-sufficiency. So who wants to help unwind energy security, energy sovereignty, energy self-sufficiency? Don't everyone jump in.
Let's try. So I don't think there's a confusion. I think that the rhetoric is what matters, right? So, and the rhetoric
Or maybe the general understanding of the people, there's confusion for sure.
I don't think there's, I think that we'll give, the administration less credit than we should. I think they just really know what they're doing in some cases with rhetoric. So there's rhetoric and there's practice, and then practice can just be shaped, to actually just match what I actually meant by this. It's like, if we define sovereignty and security this way, then we can define anything, right? So I don't think there's a confusion. I think that if you think as a leader that wants to bring Mexicanness, to the forefront, and supposedly, as today he said, we are paying for what the neoliberal policies did to Mexico today. What we are observing right now is just to bring Mexico to the front and use rhetoric to that end. I don't see that as a contradiction, to be honest. And other leaders of the same type have used rhetoric to their end in order to move forward to their agenda and change along the way, because what he says today, we live in the U.S. as well right now, so doesn't mean that it's going to mean the same thing like tomorrow or next month. So I don't think there's confusion. I think it's a vehicle to project their agenda of what the sector and how the sector fits into the bigger picture of what Mexico is or wants to be now.
But I think, Leticia, you use the word Mexico and Mexicanness, etc. That's the key. He's an avowed, deeply passionate Mexican nationalist. And so, I'll never forget, I sat down with the now Energy Secretary in April of last year, and I asked her what the plans were, and she said, "Vamos a producir." And I said, "What does that mean?" She says, "We're going to produce everything, because we want to produce everything here in Mexico. It's not just gasoline, it's not just oil, it's not just electricity. We want to produce cars, we want to produce everything." This is a vision that goes against what we have come to accept as the norm for the past 30 years. This is an idea that Mexico can be independent in food production. As ridiculous as that sounds today, that is a stated goal, and whether or not they can actually achieve it is another question. But I think that they mix together energy sovereignty with energy security and energy independence. Purposefully, there is an element of rhetoric there, but they're committed to it. Andrés Manuel, personally, I think, is deeply committed to the idea. There was an extraordinary statement that came out. I'm gonna mess it up a little bit, but he was asked, what about the exports of crude, Mexican crude? And he said, well, we don't want to export crude. We want to produce enough crude oil to be processed in our refineries to satisfy national demand. This is an extraordinary kind of nationalism where you don't even want to sell your oil to anybody else.
I don't think it's extraordinary, honestly. So if we take like a very long perspective, I'm an economic historian as well. That's another gig. So if you I just go one, it's like it gives me a deja vu of 100 years ago, right? So if you just put Mexico in the Latin American perspective, just let's go back to the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. This is not new. We've seen that. Like now it takes, Twitter, and press conference every day in order to make your message much more widespread.
Right.
But if import substitution industrialization was all about that,
Yeah.
so I don't see this as a new thing. It's a 21st century with
Yeah.
with bells and whistles. But I don't see it as extraordinary or new.
But we're not used to it. That's the thing.
Yeah, we're
Who's
not
we?
used to, I don't think
Who's
any of
we?
us, yeah. The idea of a government in 2019 arguing for ISI is a bit jarring.
Yes.
But I think, what's his current approval rating in the Mexican population?
86 or 67. I mean, yeah.
How popular was the attack on Huachicoleo? How many seats did he win in Congress? How much has Morena blossomed into a dominant political apparatus and party? My point is that
As far as working.
my point is that whether the understanding or definitions of any of these concepts we agree with or we want to argue about, I think as of right now, it's working. Politically, it's working. It has worked. It will continue to work. I think do we have time or do we have to?
Is there one more
wrap?
question?
I think there was one more question. And then,
Over there, yeah.
Lisa, I don't know if you also want to jump in on that, but please.
Yeah, I just want to, Laura Hussey from North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC. Just wanted to go back to electricity for a moment and see if you want to make any, if you have your crystal balls handy, as the functional unbundling of SENACE, the system and market operator, out of CFE was part of the electricity reforms that was to facilitate the private investment in Mexico's grid and private investment in generation and so forth. If you're not going to pursue private investment, you don't really need SENACE to be functionally unbundled. So the crystal ball question is, can you foresee the possibility that this administration might unwind that and rebundle?
Well, I mean, I have a comment, but go ahead, Lisa. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't know specifically about SENACE, whether or not they will, but I think that there is a general kind of attack on regulatory bodies and these sort of independent parts of the government that we were discussing earlier. So I think there's a little bit of an attack on the system. I mean, the system of the reform was, if you're going to have private investment, then you need to have these independent regulators. The government's, the ministry or the secretary's job is for energy planning, not for regulating private entities. And when you just had one state oil company or one state utility, you didn't have as much of a need for these independent bodies. And when you created the wholesale market and you took some of the monopoly away from CFE, you had to create these. So I think if there's unwinding in some aspects of the whole system, or at least a desire to do so, then I think you could see some changes to SENACE as well. But some things are written in the law and can't just be undone, by the government. I mean, I think the CRE continues to exist. Its commissioners have been, pressured maybe to resign, but it can't, you can't just eliminate the CRE under current legislation or SENACE. And
I think
Well,
one
it's
of
the
in hindsight, I think perhaps that's now what's become apparent about what we took at important, you call the unbundling, but the removing of SENACE from CFE perhaps didn't go far enough because it didn't create what we understand to be a sort of independent system operator, didn't create its own governing board. So although in the previous administration there was the ability led by SENER to have SENACE serve as that independent system operator, now I think what we recognize is, well, that works when the Ministry of Energy plays a planning role and sees itself as a planner and will allow the quote-unquote independent system operator to play that function. But now where there's a government that does not necessarily want to follow that script, we're now starting to wonder what does happen in terms of SENACE. Because it does seem the cancellation and the cancellation of the transmission lines and the auctions was not a SENACE decision.
right.
Final thoughts?
You don't have a yes or no question for us, Jeremy? You always have a yes or no question for us.
We can vote.
For those who've ever been to the event at the Institute of Americas, I like to always wrap up the panel with a yes or no question. But since this is not my event, I very much appreciate the ability that you allow me insert my my protocol into your panel, Duncan.
I would just say my final thought is this, is that as on so many other things in Mexico right now, what happens in the Mexican Congress is going to matter a huge amount. We've seen that Andrés Manuel now has his supermajority in the Chamber of Deputies, so he can do whatever he wants there. But in the Senate, where you would need a 2/3 majority in order to change the Constitution, he still doesn't have the votes.
And on the regulators, this interesting to watch. Sorry to jump in, but what's going on with the nominations seems to be showing this as well. Yeah.
Exactly. So the Senate has become the focus for all political negotiations for this government. And if they do have the intention of changing the Constitution, of unmaking the energy reform of 2013 in some way, then I don't think it'll happen before the middle of this administration, but it could possibly happen in the second half. And if that was the case, then the Senate will be the focus, unless, of course, there is a rebellion by the Mexican public against Morena as a party, and in the midterm elections in 2021, that somehow Andrés Manuel loses the majority in the Chamber of Deputies. I don't see that happening personally, but it's possible.
So here's my yes or no question. We'll make it political. Does Andrés Manuel López Obrador win re-election in 2024?
No.
That's a bit of a cheeky kind of question. There's a lot loaded up into that. That was a bit of a joke, but let's put it this way. You know, there's going to be a plebiscite on his midterm, right? So
In 2021.
So let's take it. Actually, that was a bad joke. But does Morena retain its majority in 2021?
In the Chamber of Deputies, yes, I think it will. Yeah.
No.
Absent some unknown economic shock, probably emanating from this country, I would say yes, it does.
Yeah, I agree. I think it will retain.
All right, Lisa, final word
Yes,
on both.
yes. No, no, and yes.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you all very much. So
Let's switch out.
wonderful
Next panel.
analysis.